Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I'm Zach Farmer, and we are just a few weeks away from the start of the season. And with that, we're going to start diving into our season previews. We've been able to kind of see these teams start to practice. We know what the rosters look like. We kind of know what the season is going to. We have a better idea of what the season is going to look like and how it's going to unfold. And so for this first week, we're going to focus on 4 teams. And we're going to start with Santa Clara, then we'll talk about the Pepperdine Waves, we'll talk about LMU, and then we will wrap this week up with St. Mary's. So with that, let's dive into the Broncos. Santa Clara finished last year 21-12. They were third in the WCC, and they reached the NIT for the first time since I believe it's 2013. They finished with a final KenPom of 76 and a final net rating of 70. This was a team that was probably, if they were fully healthy during December, and have an outside shot at an NCAA tournament. They had an NBA lottery pick in Jalen Williams. They had an all-time great Santa Clara player in Josip Vrankic. This was a team that had a lot of offensive firepower, and they showed it last year. And coming into this season, I think that there's definitely some questions and valid questions about where maybe the offense is going to come from, and then what can Santa Clara do to kind of build off of last year. I think one of the hardest things to do is always to it's like, well, if they were third last year, then they should be able to improve this year. Obviously, we know that's not necessarily going to be the case for Santa Clara. So what we can look at with Santa Clara is, of the pieces they have the returning and some of the new guys they bring in, what is kind of the ceiling and what should be a realistic expectation for this team? So again, they do lose Jalen Williams. Huge loss. You can't replace a Jalen Williams type player. You lose Josip Vrankic. You also lose PJ Pipes, which he might be one of the more undervalued players in the WCC last year. Do you think that this was a team that really didn't have a point guard, a traditional point guard, someone who could really handle the ball on a regular basis? And that's one of the things that PJ Pipes was able to provide, that leadership at the point guard position. And so again, that's going to be something else that they're really going to have to look at and figure out how they're going to replace. And then look at some of the returners. There are some really good pieces that are coming back. You still have Keyshawn Justice. He was selected to the All-WCC preseason team. You have Jordan Williams, who's coming back off an injury. You have Jaden Bediako, who made really good improvements last year, especially when he got to fill in for Vrankic as a starter during the middle part of last season. And then you have Parker Brown, who also started to kind of find his role, find his space on that team last year. And when this team was humming, there were options for Santa Clara everywhere. And then there were also guys like Carlos Stewart, who's going to be returning. I really like the look of Carlos Stewart. He's a big-bodied guard. He kind of reminds me a little bit of a Jared Brownridge type player as far as physique, but he's also kind of got this he's almost like a microwave in a bit, kind of using the Vinnie Johnson microwave analogy there, that he can put up points in very quick fashion. And I think that that's something that they're going to be needing from him and going to have to look at moving forward. And then there are the additions to this team. This is a team that knew that they needed to fill in some of those spots. Again, Jalen Williams, PJ Pipes, etc. The key guys that are coming in, so you got to start with Carlos Marshall Jr., the transfer for Tennessee State. He was a 2-time Ohio Valley Conference selection. His last season there, he averaged 12.8 points, 3.4 rebounds, and he was a 40% three-point shooter. He's going to be a really big key for Santa Clara this year as they really try to kind of pick it up from where they were a year ago. And then maybe the not to say X factor, but this is a guy who in time I think is going to be one of the guys at Santa Clara, and that's Brandon Pajemski. He's a 4-star transfer who was at Illinois last season, and this guy can score. In high school, he averaged 35 points a game in his senior season, and then during the European trip that Santa Clara took in August, where they played 3 games, he was averaging 18.7 a game. This is a guy who can shoot, and this is a guy that they're going to look to really provide them a lot of offensive firepower. But now one of the things, like Santa Clara, yes, like that's one of the things they really were able to hang their hat on last year was their offense, and should still be something that they're going to hang their hat on this year. But one of the things that was a focus for Santa Clara this offseason and going in and will continue to be is their defense. While their offensive rating was one of the best in the country, their defensive rating was kind of middle of the pack. And this is where Santa Clara can make that next leap. That's where Santa Clara can make that next jump. And you look around the conference, you look at some of the teams that were really successful and the teams that really are looked at as like top tier teams. One of the things they all do well, they all play defense. Gonzaga is one of the top 20 defenses in the country. St. Mary's is one of the top defenses in the country. USF last year was one of the top 30 defensive teams in the country. BYU is also in that conversation as well. So defense is where Santa Clara has the room for improvement. Santa Clara can start to look at how these pieces, and I think they do have some pieces that are going to be really good, helpful parts on that front. Again, we talked about Jaden Bediako. I think he's going to have a bigger year. I think Parker Brown's going to have a bigger year. I think another guy that I've talked with some Santa Clara people, and Anthony Passarelli, their play-by-play man, mentioned this name, and I think we saw some of his growth as well last year, was Jacob Holt. And we saw some of the talent that he had and what he's going to be able to bring for them in the front court, and where he can improve on the rebounding front. And I think that's the big thing for Santa Clara, is that you looking up and down their roster, they have size. It's whether or not they can actually clear the boards and limit possessions for the other teams. And I think that's going to be their next step, is being able to figure that out. So looking at Santa Clara and taking a step back, do I think that they're going to be a third place team this year? Probably not. They don't have that level of talent. Again, when you have a Jalen Williams, and he was good for at least a few of those wins late in games last year. Obviously, you can point to like the last second shot, the last second buzzer beater against BYU as an example of that. And you also have to look at how the rest of the teams in the conference have actually kind of stepped up their game. Because you look around, you can point to like Pepperdine is probably going to be better. Portland is probably going to be better. USF might be right about the same where they were, if not maybe maybe take a small step back because of some of the pieces they lost. But I think 3 through 8 are really close to each other in this conference. So any one of these teams could finish third. Any one of these teams could end up finishing 8th. This is how competitive I think this league is going to be. But if I'm staring at where I think Santa Clara is going to be, where I think that they're going to finish, I think they will fall a little bit back from third. They're probably going to be in that 5 to 7 range is my prediction for where Santa Clara is going to be. Do I think they're going to be really competitive in the non-conference? Of course they are. Do I think that they're going to be able to bring more of that energy into conference play? Of course. And as far as like the depth of this conference, and this is something, and I've tweeted this quote out last week, and it's one I really like from Herb Sendek. And as he said at WCC Media Day, in the basketball community, the WCC is universally recognized as a top-tier conference. The quality of coaching, players, the competitive balance, the high level of excellence at the top with Gonzaga. Basically, the WCC is now recognized as one of those top-tier conferences. This league is going to be so competitive this year. Santa Clara, I think, is going to be amongst those teams who are going to be some of the more competitive teams, some of the tougher teams to beat. This is also an older team still. You have guys who are returning: Parker Brown, Beta Yako, Justice, Jordan Williams, Carlos Marshall Jr. All of these are veteran college basketball veterans. They know what it takes to win. They know how to win this conference. And so we should see and expect that Santa Clara is going to remain right there in the midst and right there in the conversation for one of those buys when we get to the Las Vegas. All right. So next, let's kind of run down Pepperdine. And Pepperdine's an interesting case. This was a team that finished 7-25 overall. This was a team that finished 10th in the WCC at the very bottom. And really last season was almost trial by fire for a lot of the guys on this team because they were young. You had a lot of freshmen who were playing heavy minutes. And through that, I think they learned quite a bit. And you hear that in some of the quotes that Houston Mallett has had and some of the things that Max Lewis has said. This is a team that knows where its flaws are. And that number one thing was defense. This is a team that was the worst defensive team in the conference. They allowed the most points per game. Opponent field goal percentage was ninth at 46.4%. They were also last in turnovers. And so for Pepperdine, the message in camp, the message all summer has been defense. And now that doesn't mean that just because they're like, we need to work on our defense, that it's going to be fixed overnight. That's not going to be the case. And Lorenzo Romar, Pepperdine head coach Lorenzo Romar, even admitted that this is going to be a process, that you're not going to see all of these things happen overnight, that you'll see incremental changes. You'll see at times that the principles are now there and that the players are getting it. And then at times there'll be times where they mess up assignments because they're still learning through that process. So I think that there's a lot there are going to be more growing pains this year, but I think we're going to see a much improved Pepperdine team. And a big part of that is going to be this kind of three-headed monster, this three-headed now sophomore monster that this team has between Houston Mallett, Max Lewis, and Mike Mitchell Jr. All three were on the All-WCC freshman team. Houston Mallett averaged 13.6 points for the season, but we saw that improve once we hit conference play, where he averaged 15.9 a game, which was sixth in the conference, and on 46% from the field and 39% from three. He's already shown that he is an incredibly efficient scorer, and that should only improve in year two. Max Lewis. This is a guy who had aspirations of skipping college altogether coming out of high school. And if it weren't for him being banged up, that might have been the case. But as he got closer to college, that it became more of a reality. And that's what Max Lewis was, kind of a late signing for Pepperdine in the process. He did miss a good chunk of last season with an ankle injury. He played 21 games. He did start 2. And think about this. He was on the All-WCC team, having missed a third of the season. And he was coming off the bench. In WCC play, once he finally kind of got at least a little bit more of a rhythm, started to get a few more minutes and was working his way back to health. He was averaging 12.5, and he was shooting 41% from three in 22 minutes. That's again incredibly efficient for a first-year player, a first-year freshman in the WCC. And we also saw some video highlights of a massive dunk that Pepperdine had on its international tour this summer. A lot of teams went on international tours this summer. Santa Clara traveled, LMU traveled, Pepperdine traveled, St. Mary's traveled. A lot of teams had that opportunity to travel this past off season. And Max Lewis is going to be one of the more interesting cases because he's on the radar of NBA teams. So there's going to be a level of expectation of him that we're going to see some NBA level quality moments from Max Lewis and also Houston Mallett. I think we're going to see that from both of these guys. And it's going to be fascinating to kind of watch and see, as both of them have talked about that they both need to improve on their defense and what's that going to look like in year 2 as opposed to what it looked like in year 1. And this is a league that up and down, it's like you are going to get tested every night, especially at the guard position. So it'll be really kind of fascinating to see how these two grow. And then there's Mike Mitchell Jr., who really is he's the one who is directing the traffic out there. And this is a guy who averaged almost 5 assists a game last year as a freshman, 9 points. He shot 40% from 3. Again, you have 3 freshmen here who are basically all shooting 40% from 3. This should only improve into year 2. This is a team who knows what it's doing offensively. And that will keep them in a lot of games. And we talk about how talented this team is. They had so many losses that were by less than 10 points. So they were in a lot of games against highly competitive teams. They lost by less than 10 to Fresno State, to TCU, to Oregon, and to Grand Canyon. And 5 of their WCC losses were also by less than 10. They're in a lot of these games. And now, as their focus is on defense, we already see that the offense is there. Can they make the defensive adjustments, the defensive changes to be able to overcome some of what happened last year? And a lot of it is also the direction of the team. The direction of the team in the locker room, I should say. One of the problems it seemed that happened last year was that players were not on the same page. There was maybe a little bit of a me attitude in that locker room, and both from Houston and Max think that it will be different this year, that this is going to be a team that they are on the same page, that they're working toward the same goals. They kind of know who they are and how they need to work kind of moving forward. And I think that's maybe more important than anything else, is that they're focused and they're on the same page, which it seemed hearing from the Pepperdine players, that was not the case a year ago. And there's also some other key players on this team coming in that are going to help this cause. Bobakar Coulibaly coming in from USC. He's a 7-1 center who transferred over from the Trojans, so he's not going all too far. But this is also a guy who sat behind the Mosley brothers, and so he was not going to see a whole lot of time at that center spot. So now he's going to have that opportunity to kind of anchor this defense in the back end. And that's another thing that Pepperdine really did not have a year ago, was a solid, consistent presence, defensive presence down low. They were one of the worst rebounding teams in the league. They did not protect the paint well. So Coulibaly is going to be one of those guys who's going to be asked to do a lot. Another sophomore who's coming back, I think that I really liked coming in, that I think is going to do better this season, is Carson Basham. I really like some of the moments that we got to see from him. I think he has a really soft touch. I don't know if I actually said this in one of the episodes of the podcast or not, but he reminds me a little bit of a young Omar Samhan, where it's like clearly the touch is there, the body frame is kind of about the same. It's just a matter of getting getting the reps and getting that confidence to be able to kind of take those next steps. Because again, even like with an Omar Samhan, that took him a couple of years before we really kind of got to see that personality and who he was. It really wasn't until like junior, senior year that he kind of became who we ended up seeing. And then another one that's going to be really interesting is Javon Porter. Javon Porter is a 4-star recruit according to 247 Sports. Good athletic body. He plays above the rim. If the name sounds familiar, it should, because this is Michael Porter Jr.'s brother. He has good touch from three. He can play inside and out. I think we're going to see some really good minutes from him, and he's not going to be asked to do a whole lot year one. So there's not going to be this added pressure that he's going to have to come in and be that guy right away. You have guys on this team who are going to step into those leadership roles. You have guys like Jan Zedek who are still around, and he's going to be that guy. The three-headed monster of Mallet, Lewis, and Mitchell are also going to be part of that leadership group on this team. There's a lot to be excited for at Pepperdine. And they have some games that are going to really push them and see how they're going to get tested. We have games. They'll be playing at UCLA on November 23rd. They're going to be at Grand Canyon on the 26th. And then they're also going to be in the Diamond Head Classic, where they have some opportunities to see some better teams. They'll be playing Hawaii. Then they could end up seeing Washington State, and they could end up seeing Rick Pitino's Iona team. So there's a lot to actually be excited about with Pepperdine. Now, I say there's going to be some excitement. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go from 7 wins to 17 wins. What I do think, though, is that we're going to see them be way more competitive in conference. I think we're going to see them take really big steps this season. I think that we're going to see them probably be closer to maybe they are closer to like the 15-win range this season, where they were at 7 a year ago. I think in conference, I think that their ceiling is probably closer to being 5th. I think they can make that large of a leap, again, mainly because this conference is going to be so competitive this season that I think that there's going to be a lot of kind of teams battering each other, and everyone's kind of come to the center a little bit. So there will be opportunities for Pepperdine to kind of move up those ranks. But I also could see that the growing pains continue, and that they will move up slightly. I don't think they're going to remain in the cellar this year. And they could move up and slide up into like 7th or 8th, which is maybe the most likely of scenarios for this Pepperdine team, is that they move up just a bit, but showing that progression, showing that movement toward being a legitimate contender in the WCC. I don't see it quite yet, but they are moving in that direction. All right, and let's dive into LMU. So we'll just go down the street from Malibu and we'll head down to LA. This was a team that finished 11-18 last year. They were 9th in the WCC. And this was a team that had a lot of expectations going into a year ago. They had come off the 2021 season in 3rd place. They had a lot of the guys were coming back. There was a lot of expectations of what they could do last season. And everything that could go wrong did go wrong for the Lions. You had a number of players go down with injury. You had the problems that presented itself 2 years ago continue to present themselves last year. This wasn't the best rebounding team. They weren't 2 years ago. It presented itself worse last year. They were also not great at taking care of the basketball, and it reared its ugly head again this year or last season. But that combined with some of the injuries that they were hit with just snowballed. on LMU, and it really cost them as they got into conference play. But I think there's room for optimism coming into this season. Even though, yes, you lose arguably the two best players that were on the team. Definitely the one best player that was on their team a year ago, and Eli Scott. And then Joe Quintana also packing up and heading out. But one of the big keys that came out of WCC Media Day, something that both a couple of the returners, both Cam Shelton and Kelly Leo Pepe said, is that now they are on the same page. They are focused and pointed in the right direction. They're focused in the same direction. And so clearly that was something that was not the case a year ago. This was a team that was kind of looking at each other, not knowing what to do, not quite pointing fingers, but just like general observations of just the body language of this team, that there was clearly something amiss with LMU last year. And according to the players, this has been about team accountability, player accountability. And this was something we also heard from Pepperdine about player accountability. And this is something that they're going to take control of that locker room environment and make sure that they are pointed in the right direction. And it seems, as of right now, and obviously it's easy to say that in the preseason because you haven't played any games yet, but they're feeling good about where they are and the direction that they're headed. And you have a good slate of returners that I think are going to be able to kind of help that, along with Shelton and Leo Pepe. You have a couple of guys who missed a lot of time last year and a lot of time the year before in Jalen Anderson and Damian Douglas. These two guys were huge missing pieces for what LMU was trying to do a year ago. Douglas suffered season-ending injuries both last year and the year before. This is a guy who was averaging double figures in both those seasons. He was 13.5 in 21, and he was 10.8 last year, 56% from the field last year. So this is a guy who is going to do it efficiently. This is a guy who's going to be able to give them that offensive punch that they really were missing a year ago. And the same goes for Jalen Anderson. While not putting up as many points as maybe Douglas was, still this was someone who had 8.4 points per game in 18 games last year. He was 7.1 the year before, and 3.4 assists. And I think this is one part that's kind of key, because this is still a squad that looks devoid of a true point guard. So it's going to be really important to have somebody who can kind of carry that and be a little bit more of the ball handler on the squad, because that is something that has been missing. And then taking a look at some of the additions. And I think this is where LMU has made kind of like this jump to be way more competitive than they were a year ago. And we'll start with Justin Ahrens, from the transfer from Ohio State. This is a guy who is a 39.2% three-point shooter for his career. 2 seasons ago, he was at 42.5%. Last year was the worst of his college career at 35. Worst at 35. So I expect that to go back up, because that last year was the anomaly of his college career. So that's going to be able to space out this LMU offense. And similarly, we're going to see that with Noah Tates, the transfer from Stanford. He shot 43% at Stanford last season. So this is another guy who is going to help this offense be more potent, be able to extend out what they're trying to do. And it also gives them depth, because again, we talked about the injuries to Anderson and Douglas. Now they have enough depth with the additions of Ahrens and Tates that if something happens, they can now handle someone going down and be able to have more a solid next man up mentality with someone who's capable of filling the role. And then some of the big guys. This is where LMU had a little bit of an issue. They're They're not a terribly big team. Leo Pepe had to play a lot of minutes at the center spot last year, along with Eli Scott, and neither are terribly big guys height-wise. Obviously, like Eli Scott is a tanks, but 6'8", being kind of their tallest guy out there was not the best option. So a couple transfers that are coming in that are really going to kind of alleviate some of that. First is Rick Isenza from Oklahoma. This is a center who's going to give them a big body in the middle. This is someone who's going to be able to, while he didn't play too much at Oklahoma, this is someone who's going to really help them. This is someone who's going to really kind of help this defense, which this is the thing that has been LMU's problem the last couple of years, has been rebounding and turnovers. They were last in the league in rebounding last year. They were 9th in the league in turnovers per game. They were 8th in rebounding margin. These are areas that they needed to fix. They were 10th in the WCC in offensive field goal percentage, 10th in the league in offensive 3-point percent. Opponent field goal percentage, opponent 3-point percentage. These are not good when you're trying to win a lot of ball games, and having someone in the middle is going to help the rest of the LMU defense really defend that perimeter better. And with the depth, not only down low that they're going to have, but then also the depth that they're going to have at the guard positions, they have set themselves up to have more opportunity to be better on the perimeter, defending the three, and then also guarding the paint than they were a year ago. And they do have some early opportunities looking at their non-conference slate to really see what they could do. They have the Jamaica Classic, one of the first couple weeks of the season. They'll end up playing Georgetown, and then they'll see either LaSalle or Wake Forest. They have Colorado. They're going to be at Colorado State on November 30th. That's going to be a big game for them. They also have games against Nevada, Grand Canyon, Utah State. So there's plenty of opportunities for LMU to get battle tested before conference play begins. And this is going to be a really interesting season for LMU. I think that they're going to be way more competitive than they were a year ago. However, I don't know if that's going to change their fortunes in the standings. I think a lot of teams in this conference have improved. I think a lot of teams in that middle tier are all going to be very competitive with each other and are still a step above where LMU is. LMU may get there this season, and there are pieces on this squad that could help them get there, but I don't see it quite yet. I do think that the 8th, 9th spot is probably still about where LMU should be, about where they're going to finish. They just are not quite ready to make that next step. They will be vastly more competitive than I think they were a year ago, but I think 8-9 is probably about their finish for the WCC. All right, now we'll get to St. Mary's. St. Mary's is classically so underrated that it's almost become cliche about St. Mary's to this point, that anytime a St. Mary's team is doubted, anytime a St. Mary's team is underranked, anytime kind of forgets about them or writes them off, Randy Bennett finds a way to prove everybody wrong. We saw this last year, and myself included on that front from a year ago. I wasn't sure if St. Mary's could return to where they were. When you looked at 2 seasons ago, the way that some of the injuries piled up, they had a COVID stoppage. They had no true offensive identity. They had no one on that roster that you thought was going to be a consistent frontline offensive option. You had a lot of fine scores, but no one who was going to be that guy. And not to say that that happened last year either. For a good chunk of the season, that was not the case for St. Mary's. But what they did do was become more consistent offensively. What they did was they became that they were greater than the sum of their parts. And defensively, they were already great. They're running on 2 straight seasons where they were a top 20 defensive team. So the identity of this team has shifted. And I think maybe that was part of the problem, is that for years and years, you looked at St. Mary's, you thought of really efficient, high-powered offenses. You think about the Matthew Dellavedova years, the Mickey McConnell years. You think about even like the Jock Landale years. These were teams that could score and score in bunches. They had offensive weapons everywhere. But the one challenge that a lot of those teams had is that they weren't necessarily the best defensive teams. Now, this is one of the best defensive teams in the country. And they have been so for the last 2-3 years. And they were going to be again this year. You look at the pieces that they bring back. You look at the Logan Johnsons, the Alex Dukas, the Kyle Bowens. Like, this is a team who can defend and will defend well. So again, we rewind to where they were a year ago. This was a team that came out the gates and really opened eyes. Like, even I was a little like skeptical when you're playing some of those early kind of buy games that are guaranteed wins. Everyone circled the Maui Invitational. What can St. Mary's do in the Maui Invitational that's going to make me believe that this team is going to be here and be in the conversation in March? And the wins over Notre Dame, the win over Oregon, the fact that they had Wisconsin on the ropes up until the last few minutes showed everybody that this St. Mary's team is going to stay in the picture, remain in the picture, needs to be talked about just like everybody else. They go undefeated at home last season, with Gonzaga being the cherry on top at the very end. This is a team that changed starting point guards in the middle of the year. Remember, like, we talk about Tommy Kuhse and how good of a season he had, and the revelation that he became down the stretch, and the fact that he's made it to the NBA and he's on the San Antonio Spurs. He lost his starting job middle of last season. And I think a lot of people kind of like forget that part. And it wasn't until like he came back into the starting lineup where everything just started to click, and he started to be more assertive offensively, and he became that point guard that really honestly surprised everybody. Like, you think about like some of the performances he had in the WCC tournament and then the NCAA tournament, no one would have thought that the former walk-on would turn into who he became in the last half of last season. But now this is a team that finished top 20 in both KenPom and the net. This was a team that was 26-8. They got to the second round of the NCAA tournament after wiping the floor with Indiana. They were a 5 seed, which is the highest in program history. There was a lot to be excited about coming off of last season. And in the offseason, yes, you knew you were losing Tommy Kuhse. Then we got the official notice that Matthias Toss was going to go pro, and that Dan Fotu was gone. And then Jabe Mullins transferred, and Judah Brown transferred. So definitely there was some pieces that were coming off the board that were like, oh, okay, what are they going to do at point guard? What are they going to do here? They've solved those problems. One of which, obviously, like, is still on the roster last year, and that one of the point guards being Augustus Marshallonis. We knew he was going to be stepping into a larger role coming into this season, no matter what. Like, he started, we say like Tommy lost his starting job mid last season. And it was Marshallonis who stepped in and kind of took over that starting job for a while. And we saw some things offensively that were like, he really can be like, he has an understanding of the offense. It's just a matter of him getting reps and getting used to the pace and the speed at which that this team is going to play. the biggest thing to me is the addition of Aiden Mahaney. And Aiden Mahaney, point guard out of Campo Lindo, which is really down the street from St. Mary's, is going to be he's going to be a dude. I think that's the simplest way to start to talk about him. Seeing what he was able to do on St. Mary's Australian tour, he has confidence. He has a swagger about him. He knows how to run the offense. He looks the part of a guy who could start right away on this team. He looks like the type of guy who is going to change the dynamic of this team offensively. Now, the one thing we know, like offensively, great, but this is still a team, this is still a guy that the way this team is put together, this is a defensive first team. So the one thing that Mahaney and Marshallonis cannot be are liabilities on the defensive end. Tommy Kuhse, while he wasn't a great defender, he was a solid defender and knew how to play team defense. He knew how to keep his guy in front of him. So that's the one thing I think is going to be the thing that will keep them on the floor. And I think that's generally the case with like Randy Bennett teams. Defense is what will keep you on the floor, and defense is what will kick you off the floor if you don't play it well. So that's the big change at the point guard spot. You bring back three of the starters. We know about Logan Johnson. I think he's primed for another step this season. We started to see it toward the end of last year where his offensive game started to be more consistent, that he figured out something. And he says like it was like really just the confidence from his teammates that kind of like got him into that late in the year, just keep shooting. But he also he limited the shots he was taking from the perimeter and used it as the weapon to then pull guys out so that he can drive to the basket. That's what it looked like. And I think that's going to be a key for St. Mary's this season, is the development offensively of Logan Johnson. He's a lockdown defender. He might be honestly he'd be my front runner for defensive player of the year this year. Like, I think he's that good. I think he's going to be in that conversation all year long. And you have Alex Dukas. Alex Dukas is as consistent of a scorer as you're going to find. He's not going to blow you away night in, night out, but you kind of know what you're going to get from Dukas. He's a really good 3-point shooter. You know that you're going to get that, and you know he's going to give you that versatility defensively. And Kyle Bowen, while he doesn't give you much offensively, every so often he gives you just enough. But what you know he's going to give you is every last ounce of effort on the defensive end. Kyle Bowen, we saw him last year. Like, he can take on the best of the best when it comes to offensive players. We saw him against Chet Holmgren last year and how well he defended him in Moraga, how well he defended him in Vegas. One of the things I thought that Kyle Bowen did really well was really stay in front of such a unique player like Chad Holmgren. And that was the one thing that I think Holmgren had not seen too many guys who could do that to that point in the season. And Kyle Bowen is such a unique player that he was able to slide his feet, move to keep up with Holmgren. The other question mark is the center position with Mitchell Saxon. You lose Matthias Toss, which is a huge blow. Huge blow when you lose Matthias Toss. So what do you do here? Mitchell Saxon, I thought he had really, really good moments defensively last season. I thought he had really good moments going into Australia. He looked so good in Australia defensively. I don't think they're going to lose much there. It's a matter of whether or not he can be consistent on the offensive end, because that's something that St. Mary's teams have always had, is a big man who can consistently score. And it's not always like being the primary scorer. We have seen it in the past where, yes, there have been the Jock Landale teams. Yes, there have been the Omar Samhan teams. But in between that, you had a Brad Waldo Brad Waldo at the center, who, especially like his first few years, was not the primary option. That was obviously Matthew Dellavedova, and then you also have guys. You had Stephen Holt, Rob Jones, and that whole group. But Brad Waldo was a guy who, what you could do is rely upon him to get easy buckets. You could rely upon him to be around the basket and be in the right place at the right time. And that's what I think Mitchell Saxon is going to be asked to do. And if he can do that, then this is a team that's going to do really well. The other thing is going to be the depth at the center position. You do still have Matt Van Komen coming back from another injury. Also, the one thing, and some of the guys talked about it, that one of the guys that's kind of impressed very early has been Harry Wessels, the Australian center who's coming in for his freshman season. He's been really impressive to some of the guys on that team. So expect to see him to get minutes as well early on. Two of the other guys that are really not talked about all too much, but are going to play significant roles, or at least like pretty, you're going to see a fair amount of them and you're going to hear their names. Chris Howell is the first one. Chris Howell redshirted last year. So he's kind of like one of the best kept secrets for the Gaels, because this is a guy who is going to be a great defensive player. He's going to be able to also give you something offensively. This is a team now that has a lot of guards on a lot of guys on the perimeter. I'm not going to say guards, but a lot of wing players that can defend multiple positions, between the Logan Johnsons, the Alex Ducases, the Chris Howells, the Joshua Jeffersons, who are also stepping in, the Marshall Lonis, the Mahaneys. Like, these are guys who are all going to be able to guard multiple positions. And I think all of them are going to be able to do it efficiently. So I don't expect there to be a huge drop off from where they were a year ago. In fact, this team, to me, is deeper than a year ago. This team looks more talented than a year ago. They're more confident than a year ago going in. Also, that, and I can't dismiss like the addition of like a Mason Forbes who's transferred in from Harvard, who's going to be able to alleviate some of those minutes from like a Alex Ducas or a Kyle Bowen at the 3 and the 4. This is going to be a really good team. Like, a lot of people have they forget about St. Mary's because they're not the most flashy, because Randy Bennett doesn't do a whole lot of interviews or whatnot. But don't sleep on St. Mary's. Do not sleep on this team. This is a team I think that's going to easily get back to the NCAA tournament. I think they're still clearly the number 2 in the WCC to Gonzaga, but I think they're going to compete really, really well with Gonzaga. This could be another year where we see them knock off Gonzaga in one of the 2 games during the regular season. And this is a team that will get tested very early. They have already 4 Mountain West teams on the slate. They potentially have a 5th, pending how one of the tournaments goes. That would be the Wooden Legacy, I believe, the Wooden Legacy in Anaheim. And the big one that St. Mary's has, because they will be playing San Diego State, they play Wyoming, they play Colorado State. They have a lot of really good games on the schedule, but the highlight, the marquee for St. Mary's is going to be their matchup with Houston on December 3rd. Houston, in a number of publications, is the best team in college basketball. And for everybody else, like, they're at least in the top 5. They are one of the contenders to win a national championship. Houston is one of the best defensive teams in the country, just like St. Mary's. So when these 2 teams play each other, I expect this to be one of the toughest, most physical games you might see all year long. So mark your calendars, December 3rd, Saturday, December 3rd. I think that's going to be a great game. And not quite like the San Diego State game where a year ago, where I kind of jokingly said first to 50 wins, which is actually what happened. It was San Diego State was the first to 50 and they won the game. But this is a St. Mary's team who's going to get tested a lot early on. They're going to have the resume and the opportunities to put themselves at a 5 seed or higher. Again, I think this team has the potential to be better than a year ago. This team has the potential to be not just good, they have the potential to be very good, if not great. And you talk about like that, the fact that St. Mary's hasn't seen a Sweet 16 since 2010. If there's a team that I think is on paper right now the most capable of doing so and getting back to that second weekend, it's this team. And I have all the confidence that this team is going to do really well in the non-conference, do really well in conference, and set themselves up very well for the NCAA tournament. The schedule is indication enough that this team is ready to go. This team is looking for opportunities to get another high seed in the NCAA tournament, assuming that they can pick up enough of the W's in these games to set themselves up. So maybe you can hear it in the tone of my voice that I'm so excited about the St. Mary's team and what they're capable of. And we're going to see maybe one of the best St. Mary's teams we've ever seen, if maybe not the best team we've ever seen out of St. Mary's this season. And that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. We'll dive into all the other teams as we kind of go along in the next few weeks. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite streaming service. Be sure to check it out on YouTube and subscribe there. And with that, we'll close it out. I'm Zach Farmer. Follow me on one more thing. Follow me on Twitter at postbyzach. Have a good week. We're getting close to basketball season, and I will catch you later.